Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Ayşe Zarakol, and I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Cambridge, and I'm one of the co-editors of the special section, Crisis in the International Order, and I will be moderating this event tonight, where we will talk about some of the themes and articles of this issue, which focuses not only on the crisis of the international order, but the justice claims in that order. One of our speakers is remote, Arnulf. I can see now that he has joined. So I want to frame the discussion first by talking a little bit about what we were trying to achieve with this special section. The other co-editor is Chris Smith at the University of Queensland, Australia. He can't join because of the time difference. But our starting point is something that everybody, I think, agrees with, that the liberal international order is in crisis. Even before COVID and before Russia's war on Ukraine, there was consensus in academic circles and policy circles that the liberal international order was fraying at the seams. I don't know how many workshops and conferences I've attended. I'm sure it's the same for you on this issue. What's happening with the liberal international order? Can it be saved? Why is it coming apart? But our feeling was that amidst all this discussion about the crisis of the international order, there was an important issue that was being overlooked, which is the fact that many of the criticisms and mobilizations against the liberal international order are actually activated by feelings of injustice. And it's just certain justice claims that motivate various actors around the world to either criticize the liberal international order, or to undermine it, or more directly attack it. So what we wanted to do is to bring together scholars who have thought about these justice claims in a special section. And we also wanted to make the point that there isn't one justice claim against the liberal international order or our current international order, but a number of intersecting justice claims that often amplify each other. And we try to capture that idea with this concept, which is also in the special issue in the heading, this concept of polymorphic justice, that different justice claims are coming together at this moment. And in the special issue, we identify a number of headings for these justice claims. So, for instance, we talk about recognitional justice claims, essentially actors in the international order who feel misrecognized, either because the order only recognizes nation states, or those actors that have formal recognition, but they feel misrecognized in other ways, that they feel that they're treated as second-class citizens, or that there is a certain type of hypocrisy in the liberal international order. It promises equality and equal treatment, but for reasons that have nothing to do with criteria of liberalism, treats some as less than. Then there is the heading of distributive justice claims, and the articles here focus on the tensions around distributional issues around wealth or vaccines or other types of goods, the way these are allocated in the international order unfairly, many feel, especially between the global north and the global south. We have two articles dealing with that heading, one of which will be discussed here today. And then we have a section on institutional justice claims, the way international institutions, their rules exclude some and privilege others. Again, we have 2 articles under that heading. A 4th type of justice claim we talk about are historical and epistemic justice claims, how histories of the international are written and memorialized, and the grievances that come from historical interactions that brought this international order together. 2 articles under that heading. And finally, we have a section devoted to intergenerational justice claims, what we all past, the past, but especially future generations. And intergenerational justice claims are especially acute around the issue of climate justice or climate change, and what do we all next generation, and 2 articles under that heading as well. But the main issue, and what we will talk about today with the excellent contributors who are here, tends to crystallize around the division between the global north and the global south, because many of these justice claims are shared by the global south, and they are deployed against the global north, which is closely associated with the liberal international order. And that's going to be the focus of our discussion today. We have 3 contributors from the special issue. We will start with Arnold Becker-Loca, who's joining us remotely. He's a research professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Valparaíso, Chile, sorry for my pronunciation, and senior fellow at the Institute for Global Law and Policy, Harvard Law School. And as I said, he's going to talk about distributional justice claims. Then we have Mira Sabaratnam, who's a reader in international relations at SOAS University of London, and soon joining Oxford University. And Mira and Mark Laffey have an article on complex interdebtedness that falls under the heading of historical and epistemic justice claims. And our 3rd speaker is going to be Sandeep Sengupta, who's currently the global policy lead for climate change at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, based in Switzerland. But he's written this article in his personal capacity, and what he's going to say doesn't represent necessarily the views of that institution. He also has an affiliation with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. After our contributors have had a chance to discuss their articles, I'll open the floor to questions and also get some from our online audience, hopefully. And at the end of the event, there's going to be a reception that I hope everyone will stick around for as well. So let's turn to Arnold as our first speaker.
Thank you, Aisha. If you cannot hear me well, please wave and I'll be looking at you in case things don't work well. I'm sorry not to be there, but I'll try to make it as smooth as possible. Hi, Mira and Sandeep. It's a great pleasure to be with you to discuss this special issue and to introduce my sense of the relevance of justice claims from the South, having a specific focus on international law and international legal diplomacy. So I think my first point, which is easier, I think, to make orally than in the paper, so I'm going to start here, is that in some sense, for the South, in terms of the examples that I'm going to mention and are mentioned in the paper, it's not so much that there are issues that in relation to which justice demands emerge. So usually we think about climate change or COVID or the refugee crisis, and then we think that for some reason the South starts to make claims of justice. More than that, I think that it has been common in the history of international law and diplomacy since the 19th century to think about the international itself as an area or in relation to which justice is one of the main issues. So the idea would be to make a short comparison. While the North sees the international as a place of either conflict or cooperation, I think that the South sees the international as a place of injustice and therefore many and at the same time as an opportunity to fight that original injustice. So in a very sweeping history, the idea would be that in the 90s, throughout the 19th century, there was a demand of justice as recognition. And as that demand was more or less satisfied in a history of relative success through decolonization, that demand started to evolve into an understanding of the international as a place where you think about distributive justice. So what I try to do specifically in the article is to start from the present and realize that using COVID, the pandemic as an example, there's a very strong trend to call for the shortcomings of the pandemic and the shortcomings of the reactions of the international community, and demand greater solidarity and international cooperation. I try to show that the South very much takes this discourse and talks about solidarity and cooperation, but at the same time asks different things. So in the article, I distinguish between COVAX. I can explain more later, but basically the main system that was emerged to deal with access to vaccines for developing countries. And I show how countries of the South, rather than only arguing for COVAX, they also argue for waivers to IP protections, etc., that are very much in line with a longer tradition of thinking about international diplomatic relations, where you argue for benefit transfer, a differential treatment. And the idea is, and with this, I finished the first round, is what I want to emphasize is that while we think within the language of liberal internationalism that to tackle global problems, you need somehow to strengthen solidarity and multilateral mechanisms by limiting sovereignty, the South does not see a tension between sovereignty and cooperation, but tries to get greater cooperation by enforcing or strengthening the entitlements of sovereignty. So in a nutshell, the South uses sovereignty in order to force the North to cooperate. And then in just one sentence, the article shows that it's not a new strategy. This goes all the way back to the emergence of the post-45 international order. It goes back to a story where permanent sovereign natural resources was obtained in a long diplomatic fight. And from that, we can trace the expansion of sovereignty to create commodity agreements, producer associations, viral sovereignty later on. And that tradition is the one that explains today the dissonance that exists between the demands between the North and South. So the South, while asking for solidarity, is also demanding sovereignty in order to extract redistribution.
Thank you, Arnulf. Now, next we have Mira Sabratno. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha, and thank you to all of you for coming out on such a cold day. I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of complex indebtedness as an alternative way of thinking about how the world hangs together. So the argument that we make in the article is that the liberal international order and all of the things that we expect it to contain, such as cooperative institutions, human rights, international law, free trade, and so on, has always kind of misunderstood itself. And that misunderstanding is very visible if, as Arnulf does, if you think from the South and how all of these institutions, these rules, these distributions of power are experienced. So we argue in the paper that defenders of the liberal order have taken, let's say, its abstract or ideal character as expressive of what it really is. It really is rule-governed. It really is cooperative. It really is consensual. It really is organized through treaties that are arrived at through a process of negotiation and so on. And all of the deviations from that, instances where, let's say, powerful countries don't follow the rules, or they are protectionist instead of free trade, or they violate human rights in offshore sites. These things are deviations, but they don't actually touch the basic order, which is liberal and rule-governed. Now, there's lots of different kinds of criticisms for that. But of course, from the South, one of the key arguments is that actually the system was always hierarchical and it was always unjust. It was established not democratically, but through empire. And the adjustments, let's say, that have been made to it, sort of fought for through processes of decolonization, have not managed to dislodge the underlying power relations that have organized the system. Now, there are various complexities to this, but that's the basic claim. So how would you theorize a system that looks like people say it does from the global South? So what we do is we contrast the idea of complex interdependence. So complex interdependence is kind of a key, let's say, linchpin of liberal ideas about what globalization is. And we say it's not so much interdependence where you've got this reciprocity and this system of exchange, it's a system of indebtedness. And indebtedness is the profound condition that structures, let's say, Southern sovereign agency. It structures the global financial and economic system, which is now much more finance-driven than it is, let's say, trade-driven. It also structures the struggles for justice, right? So it's not about simply saying, these things are separate and that they're about moral values rather than material. What we're trying to do is join these two things. And we say when we join these two things, politics is about who owes what to whom and why. Right? So you start to see the struggles for reparations or for climate justice or for the return of looted patrimony as a struggle over the terms of indebtedness and obligation. Right? And of course, in a system where Southern countries continue to pay large amounts of interest in debt. And so the advantage of this perspective is that it captures that hierarchical character of global order, it captures the inequality of the exchange, and it captures the reality of indebtedness as a basic political condition in which all of this happens. So then when we think about the nature of, let's say, South-South cooperation, what you're seeing in part is a shift towards a different framework of indebtedness. It's an erosion of the monopoly indebtedness historically held by the global North and a move towards a renegotiation of those terms. And then there's great new literature, which I hope some of you have come across since the financial crisis, particularly thinking about debt as a form of power and the kinds of power that indebtedness exercises over us, not just as individuals, but as political communities and at the international level. So if we see the political order as not this kind of nice rules-based cooperative thing, but a real struggle over who owes what to whom, then we will understand the struggles for justice and the crisis of order that you have in the present much more clearly. Leave it there, thanks.
Last but not least, we have Sandeep Sangupta, who will talk about intergenerational justice claims. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Aisha, and thank you very much also. I know Chris isn't here, to both you and Chris for having invited me to write this article for this special issue, and also thanks to Chatham House for organizing this event today. Now, before I get into the issue of the intergenerational dimension, there is a bigger and an older story that needs to be told when it comes to the issue of climate justice. questions over equity and justice in relation to the global environment are not new. They go back a long time in history. And last year, some of you may know, marked the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference. So this was the United Nations Conference for the Human Environment, which was held in Sweden in 1972. And what is striking is that even back then, issues of equity and justice in relation to Southern perspectives and engagement on this issue were central to the debate. And so what I've done in my article is tackle this issue in 4 separate parts. In the first part, I look back in history. So I trace back the engagement of developing world compared on this issue of not only environment in general, but climate change in particular. And the key moment there really is the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, which sees the birth of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what is really interesting about this original multilateral response to the issue of climate change is the degree and the extent to which it takes Southern considerations into account. So it accepts the fact that the large majority of emissions have originated in the developed North. It accepts the contention that the Southern countries of the South have a right to grow their emissions in order to achieve their development goals. It also accepts a situation in which the North takes on some pretty serious commitments to finance the sort of emissions reductions or indeed the adaptation measures that Southern countries agree to take under this process, and also to facilitate and promote technology transfer. And the high point of this is perhaps the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, where you have developed countries agree to take on legally binding emission reduction cuts in a time-bound manner. Of course, as we say, the rest is history, because thanks to the US failure to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, the international system was in a sense forced to adopt a new way of trying to solve this problem. And what the second part of the article does is it looks at how the negotiations that led to the development and the adoption of the Paris Agreement which was adopted in 2015, have taken place. And the main finding of the article, when it contrasts the two periods, is the degree to which equity and justice considerations in the new climate regime are sidelined and sent to the backdrop. So the commitments suggest to compare these two regimes. So in contrast to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol, which was top-down, legally binding, strictly differentiated between North and South, and what we have under the Paris Agreement is a much more bottom-up regime that is voluntary in nature, that is less legally binding, and that almost does away entirely with degrees of differentiation between North and South that was seen in the original regime. And many of the equity considerations which were explicitly present in the previous agreement are in a sense not that evident anymore. In the third part of the article, I look at, where are we now 7 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement? And the picture is not encouraging. So we have a situation in which developed country promises, either in terms of their emission reduction obligations, are not met, or indeed their commitments on finance. So some of you may remember developed countries back in 2009 agreed to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries meet their climate challenges and their climate mitigation and adaptation measures. Not much of that has actually been delivered. So what does this all mean for global order? And this is what I tried to look at in the final part of the article, where again, all of us are familiar with the reality of the climate crisis that the world is facing today. And the worst impacts are, of course, felt by the poorest around the world. And most of the poorest are in the developing South. But I think there's one point also worth mentioning is that there is no one South. There are several Souths, and you have a situation in which one of the reasons why the entire negotiations on climate change progressed the way they did was because on the one hand, you had the small island developing states that were the most vulnerable to climate change. You had the oil producing nations, which of course their bread and butter depends on the use and generation of fossil fuels. And then, of course, you have the emerging powers in the more recent period, the Chinas, the Indias, the Brazils, and the South Africans of the world that have complicated this picture of the North-South divide. But having said that, some of the underlying features and the structural features of the North-South division on climate change remain as salient as they are now as they did way back. And some of the injustices that are reflected in the inability of poorer countries, poorer peoples to face the impacts of climate change threaten, in a sense, to undermine the legitimacy of the international order going forward, purely because of the sheer scope and scale of the climate crisis that the world is facing today. One final point on the intergenerational dimension. Now, obviously, climate change is a problem that has an intergenerational, has a matter of intergenerational equity. What do the future generations, I mean, they haven't done anything to cause the problem, right? And yet they are the ones who will be feeling the brunt of this challenge going forward. But the point I make in this article is that it's impossible, indeed, it's counterproductive to separate out the elements of intergenerational equity and intragenerational equity. Indeed, it would be a perversity of justice, I conclude, if responses to climate change were to end by pitting the poor of the pitting the people of the future against the poor of today. Thank you. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we will turn to the audience. I can see there are already many great questions online, but I first want to give the audience in the room a chance to ask questions. Maybe we'll gather 3, and then we'll turn to the panelists, and then in the next round, I'll turn to our online audience and get questions from them. So please raise your hands and introduce yourself before asking the question. Yes, we'll start with the lady in the front here. Maybe for those in the back.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hilda Rapp, Centre for International Peacebuilding. Thank you so much, all 4 of you, for a brilliant, first of all, an article in the International Relations Journal, which really kind of sums up the complexities and your individual contributions today. I was wondering whether the elephant in the room, you kind of mentioned a little bit in terms of the underlying structures of inequality, aren't to do with rentier capitalisms underlying the whole liberal international order.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we'll take 2 more. Yes, yeah, so yes. Oh, there's the microphone, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists for the very interesting take on the international order. For me, just a short question is this issue of the global South and global North, and you had mentioned it very clearly that it's sometimes we simplify it by putting them all into one box and talking about the world in terms of global North, global South. There are many nuances in between, and it often depends on who is in power and who is in government. And we could see some of the countries, example, Brazil and so forth. If you have a change of government, you have a very different change of focus. So I think moving forward, we've got to try and look at this, try not to divide North and South, but sometimes look at them in terms of what the individual values are and how that values are being projected on the international stage. One of the articles I'm busy writing on, and I hope I'm able to publish it, I'm a former South African diplomat, by the way, that has relocated to the UK, is this idea of alliance building. We're in an alliance stage. There is no absolute power, there's relative power. So we're finding what is happening is major powers are making visits all around the world because there's a gap in their power dynamic. They need to fill the gap. The bigger the gap, the more the alliances. And in that, there's a very strategic decisions being taken. What that means is that the international order is no longer business as usual, but that's giving power to countries that are developing. Yes, we can use the term there, the global South, but some of the countries in the South, because they can assert themselves more in a negotiating position. They're basically saying, if you want that power gap to be compensated, this is our needs and you have to satisfy our needs. So the world is changing where that power dynamic is now becoming more equal than previously, and that has further implications. I have a whole lot of things on that, but we can also see under COVID how the global South and global North divide stopped. And then there were many of the countries were working together. So I think this whole concept of how the legal world order is changing needs to be relooked. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. Yes, the gentleman in the back. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm gonna try to focus more on the very current moment when it comes to viewing the global South view of the climate thing. I think that the global South has recently started to buy the idea that the liberal global order is kind of universal, and at the same time it's eternally valid for development questions. So we've got more countries trying to join and get more integrated in the international society. And I guess, yeah, I do understand that it shouldn't be like a global North and global South, but I think it's about how much the global South countries are integrated in the international economy. And this is why you get latecomers and two latecomers and who are betting on the international order. So I think that with the climate now coming and imposing restrictions over the expansion of the benefits of this international economy. So I think the global South is faces a deadlock where they don't have any prospect to grow economically, and at the same time they have to submit and be part of the response towards climate change. So I think, how do you think the latecomers like India, Brazil, two latecomers like Egypt, other countries can deal with this kind of deadlock of economic prosperity and at this stage? Thank you.
Thank you. So, we have a question about whether the justice claims are actually against international order or maybe really about capitalism, and then some skepticism about the global North, global South division, and also some questions about what the global South can do in order to get what it wants. So we'll turn to the panelists. Please take any of these themes. Arnulf, did you have something to say in response?
Yeah, I think the questions are related. So I agree with the elephant of the room comment, and I think it has something to do about distinguishing the challenges that capitalism imposes on the North and the South, actually. So diminishing terms of trade would be a very big way of diagnosing from the South the problems and the challenges of development. And I think that the idea would be that there are many capitalisms, and the ways in which capitalism imposes challenges in the South has something to do with this continuity that I was explaining before. So on the one hand, it seems to me that we understand many times, rightly so, the North-South division as a heuristic to understand, but in terms of the strategies that I was making reference, it's a very strong descriptive insight. So it turns out that, to give just one example, today the negotiations on marine genetic resources beyond national jurisdiction is allying the same countries under the G77 that allies countries in relation to the 1992 negotiations on climate and biodiversity, etc. So I think that there is a strong continuity. To give another example, in the non-aligned movement has been negotiating as a group on nuclear non-proliferation since '68 until today. So I think that one of the challenges of understanding the global South is that as these strategies are less apparent from the North, one tends to think that the North-South division has more to do with either heuristic device or ideology. And I would suggest that in terms of pure descriptive strategies, there's this strong continuity.
Thank you. Mira, anything?
Sure, I'll try and touch quickly on all few questions. On the question of capitalism, I mean, yes, of course, one of the long-standing criticisms of liberal thought in general is its division between the political and the economic. And one of the things we persistently do in international relations is treat a lot of international economic questions as technical matters, right? The terms of debt or the nature of financial cooperation or harmonization of trade rules as being just, something that the bureaucrats will take care of. But these are profoundly political questions because they distribute all kinds of rights and entitlements and have ongoing obligations. So one of the things we're trying to do with the language of complex indebtedness is reunite the political and the economic things in the way we think about it. On the global south and the global north question, I mean, I would agree with Arnulf that there is something meaningful about the global south category, even though it can be disassembled. But this is true for all large categories, right? We can say, oh, there's such a diversity of women in the world that we shouldn't have a single category of women. But we can still say structurally women are subject to certain kinds of sexism, right? That makes the category meaningful. So in the same way, even though the global south might incorporate, let's say, Mozambique on one day and China on another day, like it's still a potentially meaningful category, although China is at the very limit in some areas of what that would mean. And this comes to the last point about the global economy and integration. And this is maybe not responding to your question directly, but it's about this imaginary that we have, that development is about further integration and catch up with the global economy. So to use Mozambique as my example, because I did my PhD research there, Mozambique has been integrated into the global economy for more than 500 years, right? It's been part of all of the triangular trades in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic Ocean. The question is on what terms is it integrated, right? So this is the real question. And when you talk about interdependence as a global, kind of maybe a global positive, as developing cooperation, it actually can be a site of vulnerability. And so the terms of integration are really important. And the terms of debt are really important. Of course, the US is hugely indebted, but structurally in a very, very different position to Mozambique, which, quantitatively has much, much less debt, both proportionally and absolutely.
Thank you. Sandeep?
Great, thanks. And thank you for your questions. Maybe I'll take the latter two questions. The issue of North-South and whether the South has now become more powerful compared to the past, at least certain blocks within the South have become more powerful compared to the past, I think can be contested. While no doubt, China, India's, Brazil's, South Africa's of this world form a category and they have a greater say now than compared to the past. I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is the following. Why did back in the 1990s, even back, let's just stick to the 1990s, why was the South able to negotiate a much better deal, a climate deal in the 1990s than they did in 2015? If the so-called emerging powers were indeed as powerful as one might think, then could they have not negotiated a better deal? And there, I think, that in a sense points to some of the structural frailties that still exist within the South, and also the importance of coalitions for negotiation. Back when the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated, the principal fissure was between the European Union and the US over differences of what type of climate regime they wanted to build. Whereas in the current dynamic, you have a united North competing against a completely fragmented South with different interests, different motivations, and some of these differences, in a sense, also being exploited by the North. And the fact of the matter that remains is that even when we talk about the large emerging powers, their process of development has not completed. They're still trying to integrate into a world economy and develop into a system, the historic rules of which have been set by the industrialized North. So some of these dynamics, I think, are still playing out, and how they interrelate in trying to develop, while at the same time, answering your question. The real struggle is how do you develop in a carbon constrained world, in a situation where the West hasn't kept up to its historical obligations, the carbon budget is ever diminishing, attempts are being made to push the burden of mitigation from the North to the emerging countries of the developing South, whereas the most vulnerable are the most, the small island states and the least developed countries that have done the least to cause the problem, but are yet positioned to face this worst impact. So it's quite a complicated situation, but the salience of this issue remains very crucial today. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I will turn to the online audience and their questions. I was going to ask them to unmute themselves, but I think there are lots of questions. I think it will be faster if I just read them, and then that way we can come back to the audience here and maybe do a couple more rounds. So I'll start with the question from Derek West, who asks, who determines who owes what to whom? So short but difficult question. And then Rosemary Foote asks, the introduction to the special issue states that international law has been challenged as a biased Eurocentric institution deeply implicated in the imperial practices that seeded the modern order. Has that view of international law been transcended? Is it possible that this transnational cultural practice has evolved to the extent where justice claims can be expressed, debated, or and even resolved? Abdul Malik Badamusi asks, how do we address epistemic injustice claims domestically and internationally in the current reality of the fundamental reordering of societies? Those are the questions. The three questions from the online audience for this round. Sandeep, yes?
Yeah, maybe I'll try and take a bash at the who determines who owes what to whom question. At least in the climate context, it might be easier to empirically come to an answer for that, because we know that climate change is caused by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere. It's a stock problem. So it's not just the amount of greenhouse gases that have come year on year or even decade by decade, but the cumulative collection of greenhouse gases since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And back in 1990, when the world met for the second climate conference, the ministerial declaration put it quite explicitly. It said that 3/4 of the world's total emissions come from the industrialized world. Right. The striking part of it is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's foremost authority on climate science, released its sixth assessment report last year. And what that report found, and what I found striking, and I've referred to it in my article, is that even 30 years after Rio, 60% of cumulative emissions are still from the developed world, 60% of cumulative fossil fuel and industrial emissions. And the IPCC, again, finds that, even though the relative share of developed and developing countries has changed, insofar as the absolute emission reductions of the developed world, they are still not as much where they need to be. So in terms of who owes what to whom, at least on the climate change side, there's a way of breaking up, if you go by the principle that, if you break something, you are responsible for it, you are accountable for it, then there's a way of computing the equity numbers, at least to some extent. Thank you.
Mira, would you like to go second?
No, but fine. So who determines who owes what to whom? So there's an interesting way of phrasing the question, because you can read it as who should determine who owes what to whom and who does determine who owes what to whom. And if we take the example, so actually 3 years ago, I was at, 4 years ago, I was at Chatham House, and we were debating about whether items should go back to museums or to countries in the global south from museums in the north. And even in this short time, the conversation about who owes what to whom has changed, right? Because at that time, there was a fairly settled view amongst, let's say, the hierarchies of some of the British museum sector that things would of course not go back, and this was prohibited by law, and that there would never be a consensus around these things. And yet today we are seeing the change, the evolution, the breakdown of this consensus. And what is behind that? So there's a large set of reasons behind that. Some of these are geopolitical, some of these are about good diplomatic relations, but others are about public sentiment, others are about pressure and about changing ideas of what is right. So to think about who owes what to whom, and maybe to venture slightly into the who should decide who owes what to whom, we might be able to agree that at least having what the editors describe as a fair accounting of the past, so some kind of epistemic justice, is a necessary basis on which to have a public conversation about who owes what to whom. So if you don't know, let's say, what was stolen, or if you don't know how much interest the Sudan pays to the UK, then you can't really have an informed conversation about who owes what to whom. And so at least the preliminary process of accounting for that system is something which might inform, which must be a collective kind of deliberation. The second and last thing I'll maybe say on that is that we used to have this idea that the domestic and the international were very different political spaces, that the domestic was organized by people who had very clear relationships to each other through citizenship and through taxation and through living together and sharing a national culture, but the international was something else. And that works, again, at an abstract level, but concretely, it has almost no relationship to the way the modern world actually evolved. And so we cannot use the international as a sort of endpoint for our obligations, as things like the climate conversation show very profoundly, but even other conversations about economics and culture and so on. Cool. Thanks.
Arnulf, maybe the international law question. Do you have something?
Yeah, I'll answer that, and actually I'm going to try to connect it to the who owes what question. So I think it's a very important question, because the mainstream of international law has been in the project of overcoming the histories of colonialism since the beginning, under the idea that neutral concepts after self-determination would account or would materialize that overcoming. On the other hand, more critical traditions in international law are very rightly so to remind us of the continuities of inequalities and even formal inequalities in the international order. However, I think that the stories that this presentation and the issue is rising are ones that where we see both interplaying. So the idea that there is some overcoming and the continuities are here. And I think I'll use Sandeep's reference to 1992 as an example. So he mentioned clearly that the difference in the grand bargaining of 1992, so I'm talking about the Rio conference, had to do with a more clear north-south political bargaining. But for that to be true in terms of legal strategies, there was a long preparation in relation to the arguments in the bargaining. So in 1962, developing countries or the third world manages to pass a declaration on the principle of sovereignty over natural resources. Now, if we shift forward in time, under international law in the 19th century, resources were patrimony of mankind rather than the sovereignty of decolonized states. And that tradition moves forward. And when we arrive to 1992, states from the global south say very well this agenda of environmental protection. However, we're not going to give up our claim to sovereignty. And if we're going to limit our claim to sovereignty in the name of common interest, it's going to be under either differential treatment, technology transfer, or direct compensation. And the idea would be that tradition moves forward. Now, if that is the case, the existing international legal tradition, and therefore the international legal order in general, is some hybrid monster that still has many inequalities, but in certain instances has been used as a tool of resistance. Now that brings me to the question of who owes what to whom. So I think traditionally, if this is true, the example I gave as a semi-success, the position of states from the global south has always been who the international community as a whole determines who owes what to whom. But at the same time, they're saying in terms of their strategies, we, the South, determine it for ourselves in this continuous bargaining. where the North and the South encounter themselves as groups. So 1992 would be a great example. Before 68 on nuclear non-proliferation, GATT after that, and the Doha negotiations in relation to trade, for example.
Thank you. Now maybe we turn to our in-room audience for another round. Questions? Yes, wait for the microphone. Please introduce yourselves.
Thank you. Cameron Brogan-Higgins, LSE student. I was just wondering about if you take a bit of a step back on the perception of international justice or order. And I was just wondering your thoughts or comments on whether how you see the internet reshaping the perception of international order or justice, and whether it be by mis or disinformation, or by alternatively on the other side of the coin, a rise of universal societal values. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, yes, the lady in the back. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Nanteacher Abawarnorak, and I'm a student at King's College London. So I have two main questions. So number one is for Dr. Sengupta, which is why do you think the issue of equity amongst nations in the different developmental states have been kind of ignored or taken a backseat in the Paris Agreement? And my second question is for everyone on the panel. The question is, can the feeling of injustice between global North and global South ever be fully addressed in a liberal global order, given how drain of wealth and economic power kind of determines who's more powerful than other nations? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Terry Paddock. I'm a Chatham House member. This is kind of following on from those two questions, and just the title of the talk being Crisis in the International Order. Do you think there is hope? Can the crisis be solved? And if not solved, then what, if anything, does give you some modicum of hope?
Okay, thanks. Yes, our panelists. Maybe this time we start with Mira. Yes.
I might start with this question of, can the feeling of injustice ever be addressed in a liberal international order, given its inequalities? And I suppose this relates to the last question about whether there's any hope. I think the answer to this question actually turns a lot on what happens with climate change, right? Because there's a real consensus about what is happening, what causes it, what the likely outcome is, who's going to be affected, and so there's not a lot of disagreement. I mean, of course, there is disagreement at the fringes, but at least in. So can we deal with that? And if we can't deal with that, what does that tell us about the international order? What does it tell us about the international order that the term reparations was so contentious that it had to be changed to loss and damage in Egypt, right, in COP27, because they simply couldn't deal with the idea that there would be ongoing obligations. So thinking about that makes me kind of pessimistic, because if you cannot absorb the nature of our mutual entanglement, if you cannot absorb the nature of the interconnectedness and the crisis that is a real kind of lives at stake crisis, because you are so attached to your other entitlements, can we cooperate our way out of this problem? It doesn't seem so. So is there any hope? I do think so. Things change, right? The liberal international order has not stayed the same since its inception. The liberal international order of the early 20th century and the early 21st century do look quite different in many respects. And citizenship and citizens are taking different views on what is happening and how it's happening and the causes of it. So yes, so it will change, and there may well be a necessity for greater cooperation, let's say, to do with climate change, or in the wake of the pandemic, greater uplift as there was after the devastation of the Second World War, right? So there are moments where crises are so profound that they inspire change. And there's definitely evidence of some kinds of that thing happening. So maybe I can be a little bit optimistic there.
Thank you. Arnold?
So I think so if one thinks about the history in a longer time frame, I think the liberal international law order is in fact has opened avenues of justice that didn't exist before. So that to some extent we think that the liberal international order expanded globally through a history of colonialism, but in fact that was not the international liberal order, and in fact we can think about the expansion of that order through the process of self-determination and appropriation of those rules. So from the point of view of the South, a rule-based order that recognizes self-determination, sovereign autonomy, and equality is an order that actually opens many avenues for justice. And in that, I think there is always hope of realization of that ideal. Now, how that hope matches the crisis of today, I think that then we have a big problem, because the shift from Kyoto to Paris is actually a backlash against equality as substantive equality and against the idea of differential treatment in favor of countries of the South. And unfortunately, here the stakes are too high. So should we wait until really climate change amounts to a crisis as serious as World War II? Maybe that's the point we have to wait, but that would be very unfortunate. So my hopes are very much qualified by that. So at what point will the North accept the justice demands of the South before it's too late?
Yes, thank you. And Sandeep, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. In a sense, Arnav already, took some of the points that I was intending to make. But so thanks for that, Arnav. But maybe to get into a little more granularity, how does the Paris Agreement differ from the previous regime? I think the main difference is that of differentiation. I mean, under the previous regime, you had a pretty hard firewall between North and South in terms of definite obligations, be it an emissions reduction, being on financing that the North had promised to the South and indeed to the national community. And now under the Paris Agreement, all of that has become, more ambiguous and in a sense, even contested. And that ambiguity, in a sense, reflects, the sort of the erosion of equity in the entirety of the climate regime that we saw previously. Now, there is much less differentiation between North and South. There is a lot more ambiguity as to who is responsible for climate finance. And at successive sort of milestones of the negotiation process, what started off as in 1992 with developed countries agreeing to cover, there were lots of shalls in the Rio Convention UNFCCC document. Developed countries agreed to cover the full agreed incremental costs of all the mitigation and adaptation measures that were to be undertaken by developing countries. And come Copenhagen and come Paris, that's translated to something more concrete. On the one hand, you have $100 billion per year figure, but then it's about mobilizing $100 billion, whatever mobilizing means, from a wide variety of sources, public, private, and others. Also in Paris, you had, other countries, are welcome to also contribute financing. So there's been a lot of blurring on the issue of climate financing, and even the $100 billion per year, interpret it in whatever way you like, that commitment has not been, there was an Indian Ministry of Finance study that said that, against OECD claims of generating $60 billion per year, I think it was back in 2017 or 2018, the Indian Ministry of Finance said that, look, if all the loopholes are taken out and all the double counting is taken up, what actually accounts to climate financing is only $2 billion. And of course, there are different sort of ways in which climate finance is being sliced and diced. There is no agreed definition on what climate finance is. Equally, there is no agreed definition within the agreed definition of equity within the Paris Agreement. And even though it's, even the word climate justice is there in the Paris Agreement, but it's completely thrown in a completely irrelevant preambular paragraph in which a host of other things are also thrown in. And there's a reason why that happened. And the reason for that is power politics, in which you had increased unity in the north and greater and growing fragmentation in the south. So in terms of, what does it mean for international order going forward? I'd like to be optimistic and think that, in the enlightened self-interest of the developed world, just given the sheer pressures that climate change is eventually going to bring upon everyone's door, there'll be sort of more equitable sharing of the roles, responsibilities on this issue. Maybe I'll just stop at that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. There were many questions online that we didn't get to, but we will download them and share with the panelists. And for those in the room, I hope you will join us in the reception that will follow. And I'd like to remind everybody that the issue that has our special section is available open access until April 9th. So if you want to read more about these themes, that's the place to go. And thank you very much for joining us tonight in this discussion.